On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, a 56-year-old Rear Admiral was eating breakfast with his wife in a quiet house in Washington. The radio was on in the next room. The first reports came in fragmentary, half-believed, then unmistakable. He set down his coffee. He did not move for a long time. He did not know yet that within 9 days, Franklin Roosevelt would call him into a room and hand him the worst job in America. 28 admirals senior to him would be quietly, deliberately passed over to find him. The Pacific Fleet was burning at the bottom of a harbor 4,000 miles away, and his name was on a piece of paper on the president's desk. His name was Chester Nimitz, and this is the story of how a man who had once been court-martialed for running his first ship aground was chosen to lead the United States Navy through the most dangerous war in its history. But to understand why Roosevelt chose him, you have to begin where the country began that morning. With 353 Japanese aircraft dropping out of the clouds above Pearl Harbor, discovering that nobody was looking up. 7:55 in the morning, December 7th, 1941, the first torpedo strikes the USS Oklahoma at 7:56, then another. Then more, in rapid succession, 5 at the very least. The battleship rolls onto her side like a wounded animal, and 429 men go down with her into the oil and the dark. Across the harbor on Battleship Row, the USS Arizona takes a single armor-piercing bomb that finds her forward magazine. The explosion is so violent it lifts the front of the ship out of the water. 1,177 men die in less than 9 seconds. Most of them never know what hits them. By 9 o'clock in the morning, it is over. 4 battleships are on the bottom of the harbor. A 5th lies beached and burning. 3 more are crippled. 188 aircraft are destroyed before they ever leave the ground. 2,403 Americans are dead. The most powerful naval base in the Pacific has ceased to exist as a fighting force in less than 2 hours. The man who commands this fleet is in his office above the harbor when the attack begins. Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel is 59 years old. A career sailor, meticulous, hands-on, respected by his subordinates and exhausted by them in equal measure. He watches his fleet die through the window of his office, and at one point a spent .50 caliber bullet crashes through the glass and strikes him in the chest. It bounces off, leaving a dark bruise on his white uniform. Kimmel picks the bullet up. He turns it over once in his palm. He says, quietly, that it would have been merciful if it had killed him. He understands what is happening to him. Not just to the fleet, to him. 10 days later, on December 17th, Admiral Kimmel is stripped of his command. He is reverted to his permanent rank of 2-star Rear Admiral. His career is over. There will be investigations, 8 of them, eventually. Kimmel will spend the rest of his life trying to clear his name. He will not succeed, but the truth is more complicated than the public wants it to be. Kimmel was not a fool. He was not a coward. He was, however, the commander who failed to order long-range air patrols to the north of Oahu. The commander who kept his battleships clustered tight together in the harbor like books on a shelf. The commander who read the warning cables from Washington as warnings of sabotage on land rather than warnings of an air attack from sea. He made decisions. The decisions were wrong. The price is paid by other men. Washington is not interested in nuance. Washington needs a name to blame, and Kimmel's name fits, but Washington has a more urgent problem than blame. Japan is advancing. Wake Island is under siege. Guam has fallen. The Philippines are collapsing. The United States has just lost the Pacific Fleet, and the most important military command in America has no leader. Vice Admiral William Satterley Pye, 61 years old, steps in on a temporary basis. His first major decision will define his career, though he does not know it yet. A relief force is already steaming toward Wake Island. Marines are dying there. They have been holding the atoll alone for 2 weeks. Pye looks at the maps. He looks at his remaining carriers. He decides the risk is too great. He recalls the relief force 200 miles from the island. Wake Island falls to the Japanese on December 23rd. Pye will be quietly removed from consideration for permanent command. His decision will haunt the Navy for the rest of the war. Even before Wake fell, the Secretary of the Navy had returned from his own inspection of Pearl Harbor. Frank Knox is 67 years old. A former Rough Rider who once rode beside Theodore Roosevelt in Cuba, a newspaper publisher, a Republican that Franklin Roosevelt placed in the cabinet to give his administration bipartisan cover. Knox has flown to Hawaii and walked through the wreckage himself. He has seen the bodies still being pulled from the oil. He has stood in the burned hangars at Hickam Field with his shoes turning black with soot. He returns to the White House and tells the President that the Pacific Fleet does not just need a new commander. It needs a different kind of commander entirely. The question is who? The list begins with 28 names, 28 flag officers senior to the man Roosevelt will eventually choose. Each is considered, each is set aside. The popular story that emerges later, the one told in newsreels and documentaries and barroom histories, is that every senior admiral in the United States Navy refused the job. That the command of Pearl Harbor had become a poisoned chalice, a graveyard for careers, and that no man in uniform would touch it. The truth is more careful than that. No one refuses. Roosevelt does not give them the chance to refuse. He passes over 28 men, one by one, for reasons that have nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with politics. This admiral signed off on the pre-war Pacific deployment. That one served as Kimmel's deputy. Another had recommended the policy of concentrating the fleet at Pearl Harbor in the first place. Every senior name on the list carries a fingerprint on the disaster. Roosevelt is looking for a man without fingerprints. The man whose name keeps surfacing is not what anyone expects. His name is Chester William Nimitz. He is 56 years old. A rear admiral, 2 stars, no more. He runs the Bureau of Navigation, which despite its name is not a navigation department but the personnel office of the entire United States Navy. He decides where officers are stationed, he approves promotions, he moves men around aboard day after day in a quiet building in Washington. He is not a surface warfare hero, he has not led a carrier task force, he has never commanded a battle squadron in combat. He is a submarine man and a diesel engineer, a Texan from a small hill country town called Fredericksburg, whose grandfather was a former German sea captain who settled in the most landlocked corner of Texas and built a hotel shaped like a ship because he missed the ocean he would never see again. By almost every conventional measure, Chester Nimitz is the wrong man for the job, but there is something Roosevelt sees in him that the rest of the Navy does not. In January of 1941, 11 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt had quietly offered Chester Nimitz the command of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz turned it down. He told the president he was too junior, that the men senior to him would resent the leapfrog promotion. That a decision like that would damage morale in the officer corps for years. He thanked the president. He asked to be considered some other time for some other command. He went back to his desk in the Bureau of Navigation, and he kept signing personnel papers. It was a decision that 11 months later looks less like humility and more like fate. Because if Nimitz had said yes in January 1941, then on the morning of December 7th, it would have been his fleet sitting at Pearl Harbor. His battleships on the bottom, his name attached to the disaster. His career, like Kimmel's, finished. Instead, on the morning of December 7th, Chester Nimitz was at home with his wife Catherine, 2,000 miles from the disaster. By chance, by humility, by some quiet refusal 11 months earlier, his name was not on any of the cables now flooding into Washington. There is one more thing about Chester Nimitz that the public does not know, one detail in his record that, if it became known, would end any chance he had of leading the Pacific Fleet through the most dangerous war in American history. In May of 1908, a young ensign named Chester Nimitz was given command of his first vessel, the USS Decatur, a small destroyer of the Asiatic Fleet. He was 23 years old. He had been out of the Naval Academy for 3 years. He had never commanded a ship before. 2 months later, on the 7th of July 1908, Ensign Nimitz ran the Decatur aground on a mudbank in the harbor of Batangas in the Philippine Islands. He was court-martialed. He was found guilty of neglect of duty. He received a letter of reprimand, the lightest possible punishment, and was allowed to remain in the Navy. But the conviction never came off his record. 33 years later, when his name began to circulate in Washington as the possible new commander of the Pacific Fleet, it was still there, buried in the personnel files of the Bureau of Navigation, which Chester Nimitz himself now ran, the man being considered to save the United States Navy from the worst defeat in its history, had once been convicted of running his first ship aground. On the morning of December 16, 1941, 9 days after the attack, and 1 day before Kimmel's relief will be announced to the public, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz is working at his desk when a message arrives. The Secretary of the Navy wants to see him, immediately. He walks down the corridor in his blue uniform. He is quiet, as he always is. The hallway is full of men moving fast and speaking too loudly. The country is at war now, 9 days old, and the building has not yet learned how to be calm. Nimitz enters the office of Frank Knox. Knox does not ease into it. He never does. The Pacific Fleet, Knox says, needs a new commander. The President has chosen him. The appointment is effective immediately. Nimitz says nothing for a moment. He is 56 years old. He has spent his entire career being passed over for the dramatic commands, the celebrated billets, the names everyone knows. He has built submarines. He has trained engineers. He has signed personnel papers in a quiet building. He turned down this exact job 11 months ago because he thought he was not ready. Now there is no one else. He looks at Knox. He asks one question. He asks when he should leave. The train pulls out of Union Station at 5 in the afternoon on December 19, 1941. Chester Nimitz is not wearing a uniform. The President has ordered him to travel in civilian clothes. The country is still in shock. The newspapers are hunting for someone to write about, someone to celebrate, someone to give the public a face to hang their hope on. Roosevelt does not want that face announced from a railway platform in Washington. He wants Nimitz to arrive at Pearl Harbor the way a doctor arrives at a bedside, quietly, without warning, before anyone has time to argue. So Nimitz boards the train in a grey suit and a dark hat. He carries a small leather suitcase. His wife Catherine sees him off without tears. They have been married 30 years. She knows what this is. 4 days the journey by rail will take. 4 days across a country that has just learned what war means. In Washington, behind him, the men who do not believe in him are already at work. Admiral Ernest Joseph King is 63 years old. Within days, Roosevelt will appoint him Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. He is tall, severe, famously without humor. He drinks. He does not forgive. The men under him say that he shaves with a blowtorch. King has spent the past week making a quiet study of Chester Nimitz, and he has reached a quiet verdict. A desk admiral, a bureaucrat, a man who has spent 2 years pushing paper in a personnel office, who has never commanded a fleet in combat, who has never even commanded a battle squadron at sea. The man Roosevelt has chosen to lead the United States Navy against the most aggressive military power in Asia is, in Ernest King's estimation, a clerk. King does not say this to the President. He says it, instead, to his own staff. He says it to the admirals who pass through his office. He says it to anyone who will listen. It will take more than a year for King to change his mind. Some historians believe he never fully does. The train rolls west. Nimitz sleeps badly. He reads dispatches at every stop. The news gets worse with every mile. Wake Island has fallen. Manila is being bombed. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse have been sunk off the coast of Malaya by Japanese aircraft in open ocean in a single afternoon. The proudest navy in the world has just lost 2 of its capital ships to airplanes. The lesson is plain. The age of the battleship is over. Nimitz is on his way to take command of a fleet that does not yet know this. He reaches San Diego on Christmas Eve. He boards a PB-2Y Coronado flying boat for the final leg of the journey. The Coronado lifts off into the Pacific darkness and turns west into the wind toward Hawaii. He arrives at 7 in the morning on Christmas Day 1941. He steps off the flying boat onto a dock that is still slick with fuel oil. He is still wearing his civilian suit. The harbor in front of him is a graveyard. The masts of sunken battleships stick out of the water at angles that no naval architect ever drew. The hull of the Oklahoma, capsized, floats upside down like a dead whale. The Arizona is gone. The water is black with oil and grey with ash. Every time the wind shifts, the smell of fuel and burnt steel and burnt men rolls in across the dock. 18 days after the attack, the harbour is still on fire in places. Nimitz looks at it for a long time. A car is waiting. A young lieutenant holds the door open for him. The lieutenant has not slept in 2 days, and he is not sure whether to salute a man in civilian clothes. Nimitz takes off his hat. He gets into the car. He says nothing during the drive. What he sees as the car winds along the harbour road is not what the photographs will later show. The photographs will show the broken battleships. The newsreels will show the fire and the wreckage. The country will be told, again and again, what was lost at Pearl Harbor. Chester Nimitz, alone in the back of that car on Christmas morning, is one of the only men in America looking at what was not lost. The fuel tank farm sits a quarter-mile from Battleship Row, above the harbour on a low rise, 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil. Enough to run the entire Pacific Fleet for a year and a half. The Japanese pilots saw the tanks. They had photographs of them. They did not bomb them. The submarine base, with its piers and workshops and torpedo storage, stands untouched along the southeast lock. 22 American submarines are based there. None of them were hit. Within months, they will begin a campaign against Japanese shipping that will eventually strangle the Japanese home islands. The dry docks, the machine shops, the cranes, the repair yards that the Navy will need to bring the battleships back up off the harbour floor. All of them are intact, and every aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet, every single one, was at sea on December 7th. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was steaming toward Midway. The Saratoga was on the west coast, taking on a new air group. None of them were in the harbour when the bombs fell. The Japanese sank an old navy. They did not touch the new one. This is what Nimitz sees. This is what no one else has yet seen, because everyone else has been counting the dead. 6 days later, on the last day of 1941, the change of command ceremony is held. The ceremony would, in any normal time, take place on the deck of a battleship. The flagship of the Pacific Fleet, the largest, proudest ship in the harbour. There are no battleships available, so they hold the ceremony on the deck of a submarine. The USS Grayling, 1,400 tons, low and narrow in the water, with a cold December rain blowing across her hull. The crew stands at attention on the wet steel. The new commander climbs the ladder onto the conning tower and turns to face them. He is now Admiral Chester Nimitz, 4 stars, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. He reads his orders aloud in a flat, quiet voice. He does not give a speech. He does not promise vengeance. He salutes the men. He climbs down. The ceremony is over in 7 minutes. A submarine commander taking command of a fleet that has just been destroyed by airplanes from the deck of a submarine because the surface ships are at the bottom of the harbour. It will become one of the most quietly devastating photographs of the entire Pacific War. His first command decision, made within hours of taking the colours, will shock Washington. The staff officers who served under Kimmel are still at their desks at Pearl Harbor. Captain Edwin Layton, the intelligence officer, 38 years old, a Japanese linguist who served as assistant naval attaché in Tokyo for nearly 2 years before the war. Captain Charles McMorris, the war plans officer, 51 years old, known throughout the Navy as SOC, short for Socrates, for his way of arguing through any problem out loud. They expect to be relieved. They have packed their bags. The fleet has been destroyed on their watch. The country wants someone to pay, and they are next on the list. Nimitz calls them into his office on the morning of January 1st. He tells them in plain words that any man who wants a transfer will have his full support and a letter of recommendation. But he hopes that none of them will leave. They know the theatre. They know the enemy. They know what happened on December 7th in a way that no one Washington could send out here will ever know. He needs them. Every single one of them stays. In Washington, when the news reaches Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy is reported to have set down his pen and stared at the wall for a long moment. The country is screaming for blood. Nimitz has just refused to provide any. It is a decision that, if it goes wrong, will destroy him. The men who were almost fired now report to a commander who chose them. Edwin Layton will become one of the most important intelligence officers in American military history. Charles McMorris will plan every major fleet operation in the Pacific for the next 2 years. They will work, in the months to come, harder than they have ever worked in their lives. And they will do something else, something Nimitz needs more than anything. They will introduce him to a man in a basement. The basement is in the headquarters building of the 14th Naval District at Pearl Harbor. It has no windows. The fluorescent lights buzz day and night. The air smells of cigarette smoke and stale coffee and unwashed bodies, because the men who work there do not leave often enough to bathe. This is Station Hypo, the Combat Intelligence Unit, the Codebreakers. The man who runs it is Commander Joseph John Rochefort. He is 41 years old. He is one of the strangest officers in the United States Navy. He works in a red velvet smoking jacket and carpet slippers. He has not seen the sun in 3 weeks. He keeps a card index of every Japanese radio call sign his unit has ever intercepted, going back 5 years, and he can quote any of them from memory. He speaks Japanese. He drinks coffee until his hands shake. He once forgot to go home for 4 days. He is working on JN-25, the Japanese Imperial Navy's main operational code. It is a 5-digit super-encipherment system, one of the most secure codes in the world. His team has cracked about 15% of it. 15% is enough. Nimitz comes down into the basement to meet him in early January. The new 4-star Admiral, in a fresh khaki uniform, descends a stairwell into a smoke-filled room of men in bathrobes. He shakes Rochefort's hand. He says simply that he has heard good things. He stays for an hour. He listens. What Nimitz decides in that hour will determine the course of the Pacific War. He decides to believe Rochefort. That sounds like nothing. It is everything, because in Washington, 3,000 miles away, there is another Navy code-breaking unit, OP-20G, run by Commander John Redman and his brother Captain Joseph Redman. The Redmans are well connected. They have the ear of Admiral King. They believe their analysis of Japanese intentions is superior to Rochefort's, in part because Rochefort outranks neither of them and refuses to defer to either of them. The fight between Washington and Pearl Harbor over what the Japanese are about to do will become the bitterest intelligence dispute of the war. For the first 4 months of 1942, the Japanese sweep through the Southwest Pacific almost unopposed. The Dutch East Indies fall. Singapore surrenders, the worst defeat in British military history. Burma collapses. In the Philippines, General MacArthur is ordered to abandon his men on Corregidor and flee to Australia. The American garrison at Bataan begins a death march into captivity that will kill thousands. Nimitz is fighting a holding action with 3 carriers. He sends them out on raids. The Marshalls, the Gilberts, Wake Island, Marcus Island. These raids accomplish almost nothing tactically. They are designed for one purpose, and Nimitz knows it. They are designed to remind the American people that the Pacific Fleet still exists. To buy time, in April, 16 B-25 medium bombers launched from the deck of the USS Hornet under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle strike Tokyo. Material damage is minimal. The psychological damage to the Japanese High Command is enormous. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who designed the Pearl Harbor attack, decides that the American carriers must be destroyed before they can do it again. He begins planning an operation that will draw the Americans into a decisive battle in the Central Pacific. The target is Midway. In early May, 2 of Nimitz's carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington, fight a Japanese task force in the Coral Sea south of New Guinea. It is the first naval battle in history fought entirely by aircraft. The 2 fleets never see each other. The Lexington is sunk. The Yorktown is hit by a 250-kilogram bomb that explodes deep inside her hull and starts fires on 4 decks. The Yorktown limps back to Pearl Harbor on May 27th, trailing oil. The shipyard inspectors come aboard her in dry dock. They walk her decks, they climb down into her broken interior, they come back to Nimitz with a report. 3 months. Possibly 90 days at full effort. The Yorktown cannot be made battle-ready in less than that. Nimitz reads the report. He does not argue. He goes down to the dry dock himself in his khaki uniform, and he walks the same decks the inspectors walked. He stands in the burned interior. He looks at the buckled steel. He turns to the chief of the shipyard. He says, "We need her in 3 days, 72 hours. The shipyard works around the clock. welders are pulled off every other job in the yard. Floodlights are rigged over the dry dock, 1,400 men eating sandwiches at their stations, sleeping on the deck plates when they sleep at all. They patch the holes, they reinforce the bulkheads, they restore the boilers. They do in 3 days what the inspector said could not be done in 90. On May 30th, the Yorktown sails out of Pearl Harbor under her own power, trailing a stripe of welders' spark down her flank on her way to a battle that no one in Washington yet believes is going to happen. Because Washington still does not believe Rochefort, the Redmond brothers in OP-20G have made their report to Admiral King. Their analysis of the intercepts says the next Japanese offensive will be against the American West Coast. Or possibly the Aleutian Islands, or possibly Hawaii itself. They are quite sure it will not be Midway. Rochefort and his team in the smoke-filled basement at Pearl Harbor have intercepted dozens of references to a target the Japanese call AF. Rochefort believes AF is Midway. Washington says it is not, so Rochefort sets a trap. He sends secure instructions to Midway by undersea cable. The garrison then transmits, in plain language on an open frequency, that the freshwater distillation plant on the island has broken down. He waits. 48 hours later, a Japanese intercept station in the Marshall Islands transmits a coded message back to Tokyo, reporting that AF is short of fresh water. AF is Midway. Rochefort takes the decoded intercept to Nimitz. Nimitz reads it. He looks up. He asks Rochefort how confident he is. Rochefort tells him that he would stake his career on it. Nimitz tells him, quietly, that they are both already staking their careers on it. And then he gives the order. Every available carrier, every escort, every aircraft, every submarine, every ship that can steam is to position itself northeast of Midway, in ambush. The Americans will be waiting for Yamamoto's fleet when it arrives. There is one problem. The man who is supposed to command the carrier task force is Vice Admiral William Halsey, the most aggressive carrier officer in the Navy. Halsey returns from the South Pacific on May 26th. The day before the Yorktown limps into Pearl, he goes straight to the Naval Hospital. He has a severe dermatitis. The doctors believe it is shingles, brought on by months of unbroken combat command. The rash covers most of his body. He cannot sleep, he cannot eat, he can barely stand. The doctors order him into bed for at least a month. In the hospital, in great pain, Halsey asks Nimitz to come and see him. When Nimitz arrives at his bedside, Halsey says one's sent. He says, "Take Spruance. Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance is 55 years old. He commands Halsey's cruiser screen. He has never commanded an aircraft carrier in his life. He has never run a carrier air group. He is a surface warfare officer, quiet, thin, intellectually cold, the exact opposite of Halsey in every visible way. He is the man Halsey, from a hospital bed covered in welts, trusts with the most important naval engagement of the war." Nimitz agrees on the spot. In the days that follow, as the Pacific Fleet steams toward its rendezvous point northeast of Midway, 3 men carry the weight of the United States Navy on their shoulders. Chester Nimitz, who has bet his career on a codebreaker in a basement. Joseph Rochefort, who has bet his career on the difference between 2 letters in a Japanese codebook. And Raymond Spruance, who has bet his career on a job he has never done before, given to him by a friend in a hospital gown. Yamamoto's fleet is already at sea. He has 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 248 aircraft, 20,000 men. He believes the Americans have at most 2 carriers operational in the Pacific. He is wrong, because Chester Nimitz has 3. The night before the battle is quiet. The American carriers steam in formation under a starless sky 200 miles northeast of Midway. The crews have been told what is coming. They have been told that the Japanese have 4 carriers and that the Americans have 3. They have been told that everything depends on the next 48 hours. In his cabin aboard the USS Enterprise, Raymond Spruance sleeps 4 hours. The men under his command include some of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. He is not one of them. The man who was supposed to be in this cabin is in a hospital bed in Hawaii, covered in welts, unable to sleep. The man who put him in this cabin is at his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, 3,000 miles away, waiting for word. Spruance wakes at 4 in the morning on June 4, 1942. By dawn, the American search planes are airborne. At 5:34 in the morning, a PBY Catalina on patrol northwest of Midway breaks radio silence. 2 words, many planes, a second message minutes later, 2 carriers, then a third, course 135, Yamamoto's fleet has been found. The Japanese strike against Midway hits the island at 6:30 in the morning. The Marine garrison defends the runway with anti-aircraft fire. The American fighter pilots flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes are shot out of the sky in minutes. 25 Marine fighters go up. 10 return, most of them too damaged to fly again. The Japanese carriers, having struck the island, begin to recover their aircraft for a second strike. This is the moment. Spruance launches. Every torpedo bomber, every dive bomber, every fighter the Enterprise and the Hornet can put into the air. The Yorktown, 80 miles to the north, holds her aircraft in reserve for a second wave. The first American squadron to find the Japanese fleet is Torpedo Squadron 8, flying off the Hornet. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow, obsolete, lightly armed. They go in without fighter escort. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, has told his men the night before that some of them are not coming back. He told them to do their best anyway. Waldron is a 42-year-old career officer, part Lakota Sioux, a fierce, plain-spoken man who flew his squadron toward the enemy on dead reckoning when the navigation officer disagreed with his course. Waldron was right about the course. He was also right about what would happen. All 15 of his planes are shot down. Of the 30 men in those aircraft, 29 die in the water. One survives, Ensign George Gay, who watches the rest of the battle floating in the Pacific, clinging to a seat cushion. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise comes in next. 14 aircraft, 10 are shot down. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown follows. 12 aircraft, 10 are shot down. In less than an hour, the American torpedo bombers have been almost completely annihilated. Not a single torpedo finds its target. The Japanese Zero fighters are at sea level, chasing the last of the wave-skimming devastators across the water. The sky above them is empty. That is when the dive bombers arrive. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey leads the SPD Dauntless squadrons of the Enterprise. He has been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. He is running out of fuel. He is about to turn for home when he sees, far below him, the wake of a single Japanese destroyer running northeast at full speed. McCluskey guesses that the destroyer is racing to rejoin the main fleet. He follows it. It leads him to Yamamoto's carriers. McCluskey's dive bombers come out of the sun at 12,000 feet. At nearly the exact same moment, by accident or by providence, the dive bombers of Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from the Yorktown arrive from the opposite direction. The Japanese carriers are caught with their flight decks crowded with fueled aircraft, ordnance loose on the decks, fuel hoses uncoiled. The combat air patrol is at sea level, dealing with the last of the torpedo bombers. In a window of less than 10 minutes, between 10:22 and 10:31 in the morning, the war in the Pacific changes forever. Lieutenant Richard Best of the Enterprise puts a 1,000-pound bomb through the flight deck of the Akagi, Yamamoto's old flagship, into the hangar deck below, where fueled and armed aircraft are waiting to take off. The Akagi erupts from the inside. Wade McCluskey's bombers cover the cargo from end to end. Within minutes she is a torch 1,000 feet long. Hundreds of her crew are killed in the first explosions. Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron pulverizes the Soryu, 3 direct hits. She burns from stem to stern. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, 3 of the 6 ships that struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. All of them on fire, all of them dying, in less time than it takes to read this sentence. But the 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, 20 miles to the north, is still untouched. She launches everything she has. At noon, Japanese dive bombers find the Yorktown, the same ship that the shipyard at Pearl had patched together in 72 hours, the same ship that should not have been at Midway at all. They put 3 bombs into her. She is stopped dead in the water. 2 hours later, in a second strike, Japanese torpedo bombers come in low. 2 torpedoes find her port side. She lists to 26 degrees. The order is given to abandon ship. The Yorktown is dying for the second time in a month. In the late afternoon of June 4th, the surviving American dive bombers find the Hiryu. They put 4 bombs into her flight deck. She burns through the night. At dawn the next morning, her own crew sets the scuttling charges, and she goes to the bottom. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, 248 aircraft, more than 3,000 men. Japan will never recover the carriers. More importantly, she will never recover the pilots. The men who died at Midway were the most experienced aviators in the Japanese Navy, irreplaceable veterans of China and Pearl Harbor. The Japanese training pipeline is too slow, too rigid, to replace them in the time the war will give it. From this morning forward, the strategic initiative in the Pacific belongs permanently to the United States. In his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, 3,000 miles from the battle, Chester Nimitz reads the dispatches as they come in. He does not celebrate. The Yorktown is still afloat on June 6th, drifting salvageable. A skeleton crew has reboarded her, trying to save her. On the afternoon of June 6th, a Japanese submarine, the I-168, gets through the destroyer screen and puts 2 torpedoes into her side. The destroyer Hammond, lashed alongside to provide power for the salvage crew, breaks in half from a 3rd torpedo and sinks within minutes. Yorktown herself rolls over and sinks at dawn the next morning. The price of Midway on the American side is 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. Nimitz writes a personal message to the families of every officer killed under his command. He writes some of the names by hand. The country wants a parade. Nimitz writes condolence letters. In Washington, the admirals who had called him a desk admiral go quiet. Admiral King sends a single telegram. He congratulates the Pacific Fleet on a complete victory. He does not mention Joseph Rochefort. 4 months later, in October of 1942, the men around King in Washington make their move. Joseph Rochefort, the codebreaker who identified Midway, the man who handed the United States the most decisive naval victory since Trafalgar, is quietly relieved of his command at Station Hypo. The Redmond brothers, the rival cryptanalysts in Washington whose analysis had been wrong, persuade King that intelligence work should be centralized under their control. Rochefort outranks neither of them. Rochefort has never played the political game. Rochefort does not have powerful friends. He is reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco Bay. A floating dry dock for repairing damaged hulls. Nimitz protests in writing twice. He is overruled. Rochefort accepts the reassignment without complaint. He commands the dry dock for the rest of the war. He is recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal in 1942 and again in 1958, and both recommendations are buried somewhere in the basement of the Navy Department. He dies in 1976 in a small house in Torrance, California, having never received the recognition for what he did in that basement at Pearl Harbor. The medal is finally given to his family 10 years after his death by President Ronald Reagan in 1986. This is what the Pacific War does to the men who win it. The war itself goes on for 3 more years. Nimitz commands every major operation: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. He loses more carriers: the Wasp, the Hornet, the Liscum Bay, the Princeton, the St. Lo, he sends more men to die on more islands than any American commander in history. By the end of 1944, his Pacific Fleet is the largest naval force ever assembled by any nation in human history. 5,000 ships, 20,000 aircraft, 2 million men and women in uniform. He never gives a speech that makes the newsreels. He never poses for the cameras. He writes letters home to his wife Catherine every week, in the same quiet, careful handwriting he has used all his life. In December of 1944, he is promoted to Fleet Admiral, 5 stars, a rank that has been held in the entire history of the United States Navy by only 4 men. On the morning of September 2, 1945, a battleship lies at anchor in Tokyo Bay, the USS Missouri. The Japanese delegation comes aboard in formal dress. The instruments of surrender are laid out on a small wooden table covered with green felt. General Douglas MacArthur signs first, as Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. Then it is Nimitz's turn. He steps forward, 60 years old, 5 stars on his collar. He signs for the United States of America in the same flat, neat hand he has used all his life. The man who took command of the Pacific Fleet on the deck of a submarine because there were no battleships left ends the war on the deck of a battleship because there is no enemy left. In the years after the war, when interviewers came to ask Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz about Pearl Harbor, his answer was not what the interviewers expected. He told them that it was a mercy the fleet had been in the harbor on December 7th. He told them that if Admiral Kimmel had known the Japanese were coming, he would have sailed out to meet them. The battleships would have been caught in open ocean, slower than the Japanese carriers, without air cover, against an enemy that had already proved what aircraft could do to a battleship in deep water. They would have been sunk in 2,000 fathoms. The crews, tens of thousands of men, would have drowned. Instead, at Pearl Harbor, the water was shallow. The men were rescued. 6 of the 8 battleships sunk on December 7th were eventually raised, repaired, and returned to service. They sailed again. Some of them were anchored in Tokyo Bay on the morning of the surrender. The disaster that ended one navy created the conditions for the navy that won the war. Chester Nimitz, the man 28 admirals were passed over to find, the submarine officer who took command of a battleship navy from the deck of a submarine, the quiet Texan who never raised his voice, saw this clearly. Whether anyone else could have seen it on Christmas morning of 1941, standing alone on a dock in a civilian suit while the harbor still burned around him, that question has no answer.